What is good, everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul. I make videos about Japanese society, life, and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term foreign resident. I've been in Japan for 20 years, and today's video is actually part 2 of a video I made a few weeks ago. What do Japanese people really think of foreigners, or how do they categorize or see foreigners? And today's topic is actually 2 things that I talked about in the first video, but ended up deleting and editing out because the video just got too long, which is why I decided to make this a 2-part video. But also, I'm adding one other thing to make this a full-length video, which is an actual data-driven look at how the Japanese see themselves, or more accurately, how the Japanese determine who is Japanese and who is not, or who is more Japanese and who is less Japanese, if we're going to go so far as to rank people. So that'll be the latter part of the video, but I'm going to start first of all with the 2 points that I meant to put in the first video but ended up cutting for time. The first is I'm going to show you a meme on the screen right now. Now, if you live in Japan, you understand this meme and you're not surprised by it. There is this tendency in Japan to kind of separate the world into exactly 2 halves. Japan and not Japan. Nihon and Gaikoku. Like, the entire rest of the world is just one vast foreign country that doesn't really need to be differentiated in terms of country by country. It's just one big Gaikoku. And one of the funny ways that this manifests is, well, if you've heard Japanese people talking abroad, or you've traveled with Japanese family abroad, you may have heard them just discussing with each other in Japanese, Gaikokujin are blah blah blah, or look at the Gaichin doing the blah blah blah. And you're thinking, well, wait a second, they're in the foreign country, they're in Canada or they're in Singapore, so they're the Gaikokujin, right? They're the foreigners there. And you might point this out to Japanese people and you might say, well, hey, you realize you're in Canada, so that means you're the Gaikokujin. And you'll get this look of, oh yeah, I guess so, because they've translated it into foreigner and they realize, okay, yeah, I am the foreigner in Canada. But the truth is, the use of the word Gaikokujin really doesn't mean foreigner. It really just means Japanese and non-Japanese. So when Japanese are abroad, they're still Nihonjin, they're still Japanese, and everyone else is still Gaikokujin, not Japanese. So while we often translate Gaikokujin to mean foreigner, it's probably more accurately non-Japanese. And so even when Japanese are abroad, they're still not Gaikokujin. So that's one way that Japanese look at foreigners. Now, those of you who live in Japan, and you might say in the comments, well, there's more nuanced thing here. Gaikokujin is very often used to just refer to Westerners. And people from other Asian countries are often referred to as Asiajin, which is a little ironic considering, Japanese are technically Asians themselves. But there is that differentiation sometimes. Like, Gaikokujin kind of has an image of non-Asian outsider, and Asiajin will be used for Asian people. So there is that truth. But the Gaikokujin does, I believe, include people from like Africa, for example, that I'm not sure you could really call those Western countries, but are included as Gaikoku along with the rest of the Westerners. You don't usually hear people saying Afrika-jin per se. It's usually just Gaikoku-jin from Ghana or Nigeria or something. The second thing I wanted to talk about in terms of how Japanese sometimes view foreigners is maybe going to be a surprise to some of you, and that is foreigners can often be seen or used as a place to vent or voice frustrations or complaints to, because Japanese don't feel comfortable or wouldn't say these things to fellow Japanese. And the reason for this is often because as a foreigner, you kind of exist outside the social hierarchy, and Japanese aren't risking any kind of social capital by informing you of what they don't like about what's happening in their life or what's happening in their relationships. I've had a number of my university students confide things in me and basically tell me that they just can't talk to anyone else about this. And because I'm a foreigner, like, I'm a safe place to kind of vent to. And I mean, imagining this in my own context of where I came from, imagine like I have some kind of social issue with my friends and I approach my immigrant neighbor and I vent to them about this. That doesn't seem like something most Americans would do, but in Japan it's a safe thing because we kind of exist outside of that social order, and therefore we're safe. They're not going to be risking any of their social connections by talking to us because we don't count, I guess. I talked recently on the channel about Donald Ritchie's The Inland Sea, which is about his journeys around the inland sea of Japan in the 50s. And he recounts this story of this young man who was a Shinto priest on a local island there. And he just basically vented to Donald Ritchie about how he was forced to become the priest of this Shinto shrine. His real dreams were to go off to the big city and have a normal job and kind of have a normal life and maybe get married and that kind of thing. But he has to carry on this tradition as the eldest son, and now he's stuck on this island for the rest of his life. And Donald Ritchie was the only one he could talk to about this and kind of vent his frustrations to a foreigner, because not only is the foreigner outside of the social hierarchy on that island, but is transient. Donald Ritchie was just traveling through, and so, who's he going to tell? Or, he's not going to tattle to anyone else, so he's a safe person to talk to. So yeah, if you live here as a foreigner, you may have found yourself acting as a shoulder to cry on for Japanese people when they don't feel they can talk to anyone else about something. Okay, so those were the two quick things that I excluded from the previous video. And now I want to get into the issue of who the Japanese see as Japanese, based on the data I've collected over my years of teaching a particular class at my university. So I often start the semester, when we do self-introductions at the beginning, telling this joke. And the joke is simply, I ask the students to raise their hand if they've climbed Mount Fuji. And in a class of 30 to 40 students, maybe 1, 2, possibly 3 students raise their hand. And then I mentioned that I've climbed Mount Fuji 3 times to the summit. And I say then, look, you and me, we're the only real Japanese in this room. And that gets laughter. And the reason why that gets laughter is because there's this undercurrent of understanding that, yeah, there is kind of a thought in Japanese people's minds of they need to show and always be present and aware of their Japaneseness. And, being seen as not Japanese would be a huge travesty. Now, not that this is a huge risk in Japan for people, but it is something that exists on people's minds. And you'll see this also, people will joke about how Kyoto people are like really Japanese because they're from the ancient capital and, the seat of so much Japanese high culture, etc. But this does exist in a negative way in that you will see discrimination, for example, against returnees to Japan. So Japanese who have spent time overseas because their parents were over, in Canada or somewhere for business, and therefore they went to elementary school in Canada or junior high school or something, and so they've been away. And that means they don't have those years of acculturation as their classmates did, and they have acculturation in a different culture, so they're coming back to Japan with foreign thoughts and foreign ways of doing things. And there can be genuine bullying and discrimination against returnee students for that reason. My first experience with this was when I was an assistant language teacher in a junior high school classroom, and there was a returnee student whose English was basically fluent, but refused to talk in class. Basically just wanted to appear like all the other students who didn't have really any speaking ability and just refused to talk. And the student just didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to be potentially ostracized or seem special or different than everyone else, and so they refused to talk. So the activity I do in the classroom it's all kind of a lead up to academic discussion and debate. And the focus of the class is on how to determine criteria. So if you have an opinion or you have an idea about something, what criteria do you use to reach that opinion or defend that opinion from people who might disagree with you? And so establishing criteria is basically the focus of the lesson. And I give them this graphic here. we have 4 people. We have A-san, B-san, C-san, and D-san. And A-san, as you can see, born and raised in Japan, Japanese parents, school in Japan, speaks Japanese, but eventually moves to Australia and then takes Australian citizenship at some point. Person B, again, Japanese parents, but born and raised in Texas and went to Texas schools, and so English is the dominant language. And they hold both passports because if you're born in America, you automatically get American citizenship. Person C is born to Canadian parents, but in Japan, and goes through the Japanese school system. Their dominant language is Japanese, but they don't have the passport because, well, if you're born in Japan, that doesn't mean you're Japanese. Now, D-san is basically a mirror of A-san in that they're born and raised in a different country and then move to Japan and take Japanese citizenship. And one thing to know about D-san is that, well, to get Japanese citizenship, you do have to have pretty much really good Japanese language ability because there's an interview process, there's all the paperwork, so you're going to have to demonstrate you can speak Japanese. So we know D-san has the Japanese ability. And like I said, A and D are kind of mirrors of each other, B and C are kind of mirrors of each other, and then I asked the students to brainstorm how many different criteria they can come up with that could possibly be used to determine who is Japanese and who is not, or who is more Japanese than who. And they come up with a list, usually of 12 to 15 items, and things on there are like ethnicity, where they're born, the citizenship they hold, whether they speak Japanese or not. And then after we have this list of items, I have the students go through and break down which criteria they feel are stronger, which they feel are weaker, and are there any that have particularly fatal flaws. Like a common one for that is usually a student will say love for Japan as a criteria, and someone will then point out, well, what about the person in France who like loves anime and is really into all things kawaii and just has this beautiful image of Japan and they love Japan? Are they Japanese? And then the students are like, yeah, they're not Japanese. So we identify those potential flaws. But long story short, what in the end do most of the students decide are the criteria that really means whether someone is Japanese or not? And first of all, they do vote on the people they think are Japanese, and A gets the most votes. The person who was born, raised in Japan, speaks Japanese, acculturated in Japanese culture, and they have their parents in the bloodline is Japanese. B gets about 25% of the vote of a class, meaning a lot less people see B as Japanese, despite having the Japanese blood, but they don't have the acculturation and the language. C gets slightly less than B. They have the acculturation and language, they don't have the official citizenship, and they don't have Japanese parents, so they don't have the bloodline. And finally, D gets usually the second most votes. Now, from what I'm about to say about what criteria actually seem to matter, it would mean that D shouldn't get as many votes as D does, and it's never really made sense to me why students vote for D, except that I think me being in the room biases the students to vote for D, because they're smart enough to recognize that if I were to take Japanese citizenship, like I am D. I'm not from South Africa, but I would be just like D. And I think the students realize that either consciously or subconsciously, and therefore they give the sympathetic vote of, oh yeah, they'll be Japanese. At this point, I've usually not given my opinion on anything, but I will bring up to them, I'll say, I'm not sure in my case if I would identify myself as being Japanese if I became a citizen. I would probably start saying I'm a citizen of Japan, but I wouldn't start saying I'm Japanese, because I've been here long enough to realize that Japan is not really a country where the passport makes you the thing. As an American, we should think that way, because that's essentially what America is. If you are an American citizen, that makes you an American. I know some people don't think that in America, and that's a different topic for a different channel, I think, but in Japan, that's certainly the case. And so the 3 criteria that it really comes down to for these Japanese students is blood, acculturation, and language. Those are really the 3 things that students use to determine who is Japanese and who is not. And the stronger the combination, the better, which is why B and C get a few votes, but A really has the strongest number of votes, because even though they've changed their passport, they're still Japanese in all three of those things. And so that's an important thing to note. Like, it's a way of thinking in Japan that might be different from the way you think of who is French, who is German, who is Nigerian, who is Argentinian, etc. From wherever you're from, that thought process might be different, or it might be the same. Let us know in the comments if that rings true with you too. I will say this, there's one caveat I would put in for person B. If you live in Japan, you probably know where I'm going with this, but that is, if person B, who is of Japanese blood but was born and raised somewhere else, or mostly born and raised somewhere else, actually many people will say they are fully Japanese if they become wealthy, famous, or are important in some way. So like Osaka Naomi, great tennis player, everyone just, yeah, she's Japanese for sure. So if you have Japanese ethnicity and you are not sure you'd be accepted in Japan, that's quite possible given the number of people who didn't vote for person B. However, if you become really good at tennis or you become really good at something, the calculation might change in your favor, and very often does, because the Japanese want to take pride in what, people of Japanese blood have accomplished in this world. So I don't make the rules, but that seems to be how it works. Okay. Let us know in the comments what you think about what I had to talk about today, and do you agree or disagree with anything? If you actually want a peek at the data that I'm talking about, I can provide that for you. Might have to clear that with a review board beforehand, but yeah, if you really want to see the data, I can maybe make that happen. At any rate, thank you so much for watching this particular video. This is part 2 and the final part of talking about what Japanese think of foreigners. So there might be a part 3 in the future, but I have not planned that out in my brain. So this is the last of it for now. Like, subscribe, join my Patreon, for example, if you want to, and I will catch you on the next video. Peace.